Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today I'm sharing with you an interview I did with Dr. Sherry Walling, a clinical psychologist who's written a book about her own personal grief journey called Touching Two Worlds. It's a beautiful book, and I think you'll really enjoy our conversation. So stay tuned for that. Be sure and hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already. Also, subscribe, review, and leave a rating for the podcast wherever you happen to listen to podcasts. And if you're able to help support this podcast a little bit financially, go to eoluniversity.com/support and find out 3 different ways you can make a small contribution to help keep us on the air. So now we'll move on with my conversation with Dr. Sherry Walling. Today, I'm so excited to welcome my guest, Dr. Sherry Walling. Sherry is a clinical psychologist, speaker, podcaster, and entrepreneur. Her life's work is helping high-achieving people navigate painful and complex experiences. Her podcast, Zen Founder, has been called a must-listen by both Forbes and Entrepreneur magazines. Her new book, Touching Two Worlds, a guide for finding hope in the aftermath or in the landscape of loss, is a poetic, incisive exploration of grief and joy in the aftermath of loss. And we'll be talking all about that today. Sherry resides in Minneapolis. She's been known to occasionally perform as a circus aerialist, and I will talk to you about that too later on. And you can find out more about Sherry's work at her website, sherrywalling.com, or the book at touchingtwoworlds.com. So Sherry, thank you so much for joining me here today.
My pleasure, Karen. Thanks for having me.
Well, ever since I read the book, I've just been so interested to talk to you. Your book is so beautifully written and so profound. And as a psychologist, you've written it with all the knowledge that you've gathered about grief throughout your career, but by sharing your own personal story and being so vulnerable in this book, you really just take us by the hand and bring us right into this landscape of loss as you describe it. And it's just so profound and so touching. And I just want to thank you for writing such a beautiful book.
Well, thank you. Thank you for reading it. It's I think there's nothing more gratifying than being, you know, being able to share of yourself and have that land in a way that's meaningful with other people. And so that's the intention behind the book, is that it lands, is that it's helpful, is that it sort of strikes people at the heart of what they're holding. So,
Well, you share with us in such a raw and honest way your own personal story of loss. And maybe we should begin, if you wouldn't mind, just talking about that briefly for our listeners so they understand
sure.
where this is coming from.
Yeah. So the book, as you mentioned, is really a combination of my life as a psychologist, but it's heavily based on my own experiences of loss. And there are 2 losses in particular that sort of create the backbone of the book. The first is the loss of my father to esophageal cancer, and the second loss that happened really kind of in a parallel process to my dad's illness and death was my then 33-year-old brother's sort of losing battle with alcohol addiction and depression that ended in his death by suicide 6 months after my dad died. So they both kind of imploded at the same time, which was an immersion into illness and grief that, was certainly different than I expected for my life, but became this very painful, but a teacher, an invitation to look inside and to begin exploring grief in more depth.
It's almost just unfathomable that you could be handed both of these losses so close together. And wow, the devastation of that experience.
It is, but the more that I am in this grief space, the more I hear similar stories. Of course, because of the way that deep loss exacerbates whatever vulnerabilities already live inside of us. So, my brother's death, I think was related to my dad's death, was at least in part exacerbated by the deep grief that he felt about losing my dad. And I think that actually happens in quite a lot of families. We talk about sometimes death by heartbreak. Um, I remember reading relatively recently one of the teachers that was killed in the Uvalde shooting in Texas last year, or last school year rather. Her husband died of a heart attack a week later. You know, our bodies really suffer under the weight of grief, as you well know. But these groupings of grief really, they sort of happen more than I realized before I kind of entered this story.
It's true. I even read recently about Queen Elizabeth's death, that Prince
Mm.
Philip died last year, and also her favorite dog, her favorite corgi, died not that long before she died,
Yeah.
and that sometimes just the heartbreak itself, may contribute to our end
Yeah.
of life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you titled the book Touching Two Worlds. So I thought maybe you could tell us what you mean by the two worlds and what are they?
Yeah. Yeah. The title comes from this moment that I experienced. It's a very specific moment. I write about it in the book, but it was a couple of days after my dad had died, and I had been with him in California, present with his death. And I returned home to my family home in Minnesota, and was sitting with one of my children who was around 8 at the time. And it was sunrise in November, so it was a fresh snow, and the colors of the sunrise were just kind of, you couldn't tell what was the reflection on the snow and what was coming from the sky. And it was this beautiful moment, and my son is sitting here, and I felt so much, joy and life, and so affected by the beauty of the moment that I was in. And then recognize that also at the very same time, I was deeply aware of this deep grief and this sort of sorrowful world of illness and falling apart and people I love breaking down. And so for me, the two worlds are just that. It's this sort of parallel realities of living in deep joy and aliveness, and also a deep sense of fragility and death, sometimes in the same moment, sometimes in the same day.
And I've had that sense and read about it as well, that it's really sorrow that deepens us, our pain that really almost hollows us out, so we have more capacity to experience joy, and that they really do come hand in hand. And I think you quote from the Naomi Shihab Nye poem
Mm-hmm.
about kindness. Before you can know kindness, you have to know sorrow.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that sense of expanding on both edges, I think, was something that was very much part of my grief. Like expanding into the darkness and expanding into the light, expanding into this like deep sense of sorrow and also this deep sense of joy. And it's sort of like they happen in parallel. They happen in the same measure on one end of the spectrum as they happen on the other end of the spectrum.
Mm.
And it
So,
felt important to talk about that. I think sometimes we think of grief as like one thing. It's the sad, it's the angry, it's the still quiet coldness. And it is all of that. And also this invitation to this richness and joy.
and you also wrote that this book is about how your losses reshaped you, and I feel like that's an important point about grief as well, is that
Mm.
it necessarily reshapes us in our lives. As you said, it expands us, it changes us in ways. And I remember back when I was grieving over my father's suicide death,
Mm.
I didn't want to change in the beginning. I was trying to resist changing. In fact, I wanted to go backwards in time and go back to how things had been
Yeah.
before, until I realized that was keeping me hopelessly stuck. And that seems like, actually, for me, it was a profound realization that, oh, this is supposed to change me. This is supposed to change who I am and how I am in the world. And I love that you write about that as well.
Yeah. I think one of the things that becomes important really early in grief is
like refiguring out how to introduce yourself. You know, I'd meet people and they would say, where's your family from? And I had to then reshift my identities in the world. So instead of my parents live in California, it was my mom lives in California. Or instead of I have two younger brothers, I have one brother that lives in Sacramento and I have one brother that's passed away. And those very little subtle shifts, but they're super important because they're core, are ways of affiliating ourselves with the people that are in our lives. When they're no longer in our lives, those affiliations they have to be amended. And I think that simple act has deep significance for how we're creating the flexibility in this space to reorient ourselves in sort of this post-death world or post-loss world.
That makes so much sense, that we're really relearning these relationships that we've had in the past that we've taken for granted really for all of our lives, and having to relearn and reshape that. But there's something about the process of doing that that can help us even feel even more connected to our loved ones, even though they're not physically present, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think about you and your impulse to try to fight against it, right? To go back in time, which is, oh, of course, like so normal that would be the wish, would be to undo and to go back. But I think that looking backwards becomes really tricky. It can feel pathological. We can get stuck there if we don't hold the past in tension with the present and then in hope with the future, right? Sort of be able to traverse the whole timeline, not just focus on one component of it.
Yes, definitely. That makes so much sense. And well, I was curious to ask you, because you experienced the death of your father to cancer and then your brother to suicide, that how you would describe for listeners the differences in a way in the grief process over those two types of deaths that you experienced in your life, because to me it seems as though there's a difference in them. But
Yeah. And I think this is really important to speak about, but also I want to acknowledge that this feels very anchored in my experience. So it's not that this is always different for everyone, or that cancer feels one way and suicide feels one way, because that's not true. But for me, one of the things that felt really different between these deaths is that I was present with my dad when he died. And so I was with him the last week of his life. I was in bed with him when he died. He was surrounded by me and my mom and my brothers. And there was a beauty and a sacredness to that moment, even though it was very sad. You can hear in my voice, even now, it's very sad. I miss him. But the experience of sort of like his actual death was as if we kind of walked him up to the gate and waved goodbye and said, good job, good luck, see you later on the other side, or whatever it is. But it had a sense of connection. And I think my brother's death felt more traumatic. I mean, it really rocked my body in that trauma way, because he died far away. He died in a very violent way. And there was no sense of like, I couldn't comfort him. I couldn't be, there was no presence. It was very lonely. And I think that feels very different as a loved one. In other ways, it was somewhat similar. My brother was struggling. Like, his suicide was not a shock if you look at it from sort of a disease progression model. Like, all of the warning signs were there, and we knew that was a danger for him. But his actual death was so jarring that even though in some ways perhaps I had some preparation, it just could not have prepared me for how it felt to receive that news and to then feel so separate from his body and his self.
I remember feeling that deep pain of not having had the opportunity to say goodbye, or to at least just express love and
Yeah.
have that closeness with my father at all before he died, that just felt like such a tremendous loss that I could not get past. There was nothing I could do about it. It was that
Yeah.
opportunity just didn't exist, and I had to live with that and live with the pain of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like it raises lots of big questions about what it means to die well. And, you know, I realize all of the complexity of what I'm about to say, but in some ways I wish that if I'd known my brother really was going to die, I could have at least been present with him. And we don't really have a framework for that in mental health, and it gets very, very complicated and confusing and, you know, ethically ambiguous and all of those things. But just on this very visceral level, um, I wish I could have, you know, sort of held his hand and been there with him the way that I was able to be with my dad.
Yeah. Yeah, I resonate with that feeling of having a sense of just the loneliness and isolation my father was feeling the day he made that choice for himself also, and that there was nothing I could do to ease the pain that he
Yeah.
was experiencing. But another thing that you and I share is being medical professionals who work with people who are hurting and suffering.
Mm-hmm.
For years, I've just struggled with a lot of guilt over not being able to save my father or not being able to
Mm-hmm.
fix him.
Save in quotes, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I know that it's common, well, with all kinds of death,
Yeah.
family members and loved ones feel guilt, but particularly suicide. But I think there was
Yeah.
something on the professional level, it really caused me to question, am I even good at my job? Should I even keep doing this?
Yes.
I couldn't save the one person I love the most, so how could I
Yeah.
expect that I'm going to save a patient?
Yeah. I have an essay in the book called "I Might Be Too Messed Up to Go to Work" or something like that, where I'm just exploring that same, you know, as a psychologist, especially like basis of training. It's like suicide risk and assessment and suicide intervention and prevention. And I think that almost always, suicide carries with it those extra grieving layers of guilt and responsibility and reviewing the past, because it has that element of choice, sort of. I mean, I'm not really able to say that cleanly because I don't know that I believe that it truly, like, someone just decides one day. But it has a lot of grief complexity, especially as a professional, where we are told that it's our job and responsibility. It's what we sign up for when we take on these roles and train for years, is to be able to help in these most desperate situations. And so it really, I think, rocks professionals to the core when they realize so dramatically the limits of their ability to help and the limits of their ability to intervene. I think there were some mercies in my story with my brother, in that because I did know he was sick, there were lots of measures taken. There were lots of measures taken, lots of times of showing up in the hospital, and lots of help offered, and lots of love given. And I think at the end of the day, I feel like I did the best I could, and it's all I could do, you know. It sort of has to be enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I know one thing I finally, after years of working on it, a recognition I came to is that this was my dad's choice and this was his life and what he chose to do with it, and that it wasn't really my role to intervene or to change his life in a way. It wasn't my responsibility to change his life. And I asked myself the question, knowing that he was suffering and he was really hurting and life was very, very painful for him, would I ask him to stay here one more day? or another year for me so that I would not be so hurt by his death. And I realized, no, out of compassion for him, like he had a right to choose his own path and make that choice.
That's one of the things that I really wrestled with in the book. I think if there's an essay in the book that honestly I'm most proud of putting out in the world, I don't know if that's a word. I don't know if that's really the right sentiment, but it's the reflection on the different things that I said to my dad and my brother as they were dying. And in the case of my dad, it was always, it's okay to let go. Like, you've done well. It's okay to release yourself to this. And it was said with such kindness and with just a desire for him to be at ease. And everything I ever said to my brother was, hold on, keep fighting, hang in there, stick it out. You got this, and again, it was meant with kindness, but I never would have said that to my dad, not when it became clear he was going to die. And so in retrospect, the things that I said to my brother, given how much he was suffering, I don't know, there's a certain unkindness in it. There's a certain do better, keep fighting, try harder. When again, there's a part of me that wishes that I could have said to him, like, I'm sad you're leaving. It's not what I want, but I love you and I wish you the ease that you seek.
That's beautiful. And I can say that's exactly the message that I would like to send to my father, though I guess I feel like I send that message to him all the time in a way through my heart now that please, I hope that you find ease wherever you are or whatever you're experiencing or whatever exists after this. Well, another thing you write about that really touched me was because you're a mom with 2 young children and being a mom who's grieving deeply while raising your children and figuring out how to talk to them and how to explain to them. Because similarly, I was a mom. My kids, though, were very young. I had a 2-year-old and a 4-month-old when my dad died. But honestly, I think about for my poor kids, like their whole life, they've known me as a grieving mother, really, since they were very tiny. And I really appreciated your reflections on that.
Yeah, that was hard because they really, my kids were 8 and 12 when my dad and brother died. And so they knew them both quite well. And my brother, Dave, didn't live with us in our home, but spent the last few years of his life in the same city that we live in. And so was often in our home and was just really a part of my children's lives. And so they're experiencing significant grief and confusion, right? Just that these grownups who they love can sort of be there one day and then one day not. That really rocks the world of stability in the life of certainly an 8-year-old. And so my youngest son was quite worried about me dying. It's sort of the kid logic of, well, if he was here and he's young and sort of healthy-ish and he can die, does that mean you can die? Are you going to die? So for 6 months, it was like every time I was at the store longer than expected or went on a business trip or any, he would call, where are you? What are you doing? Are you okay? Or, just, and then as COVID happened, he was quite anxious about, everybody was anxious about COVID, but he was sort of extra anxious. And so I think to try to parent through those moments and also tend to my own limits, of my patience and energy and my very tender heart, was certainly like a difficult time, but one that I see so much tenderness in my kids. And I think that this is part of that for them. Like this is their story and that they've known this kind of loss too. And I wouldn't wish it for them, but I feel like in a world where kids can be a little bit rough around the edges, like their experiences of grief, I think, have deepened them
Hmm.
and made them kind.
That's really beautiful. And I have my daughter was the 4-month-old baby that I held in my arms during my father's funeral. And I can say now it's so nice having gone through a lot more years of living to be at a point to
Yeah.
look back at that. And my daughter now is in nursing school. And in her application for nursing school, she talked about wanting to be a hospice nurse. And she said,
Mm.
because I'm comfortable with death because I grew up with it. I grew up with death
Mm-hmm.
and grief, and I've known it my whole life. And it was like, wow, powerful. And yet
Mm.
it has shaped her and who she has become, and now her career path as well.
Yeah. I think, I mean, grief is real tricky with kids, and it's probably too big of a topic for us to totally dive into. But I will say that one of the things that troubles me is how little we talk about grief with our children. And watching my brother's implosion as my dad was dying, it just made me feel like we aren't prepared for this until we're in the middle of it. And I kind of wish we had a different approach to it as parents. And I think this is becoming more the trend as people are thinking more about, I think, dying with intention and sort of the death doula movement. It has brought this more to the conversation and public consciousness, but like helping children prepare for grief and to think about death as part of life kind of early on in their developmental trajectory, I think is very helpful because it's a big one, right? It's a huge emotional upheaval. And it's something I think we can prepare our kids for a little bit better than we do.
It's so true because, and you write about this too, that grief is really inevitable. I mean, it affects everyone ultimately. And so to not talk about it and not
Yeah.
prepare prepare ourselves for it, it seems ridiculous in a way when I think about it. Like, how is it that we've reached this place where we cannot even have these conversations back and forth about what it's
Yeah.
like to go through grief?
Yeah, my generation of parents, you know, many of us are very aware that something like a conversation around sex or drugs or alcohol is like lots of mini conversations that happen early and continue on. You know, there's just this like new way of thinking about difficult or emerging maturity kinds of conversations with kids. And I want to put death and grief in that pile of like, oh, these are just really important topics that you sprinkle in throughout your children's lives so that they know when they get to this phase or when they encounter this kind of loss, that these are the sort of expected feelings or these are some things that may happen or be
Exactly.
kinder. Yeah.
Exactly. And it would change so many things for us if we did have that preparation. Not to say that grief would hurt any less, but if we're more aware of it and we could build a little bit more resilience and better
Yeah.
coping skills in a way, we would still go through the pain of it all. But it might be that we would find more ease in the process, or we would at least have more tools available to us.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe less isolating and maybe more compassionate towards both ourselves and those around us who are grieving because we have a sense of how significant it is.
It's so true. And you mentioned, like, if only we could bring back the black armbands that signal to everyone that we're grieving. But then I started wondering, but at some point, most people might be wearing armbands. I don't know. There are
Yeah.
probably far more people grieving and we don't even realize it.
Maybe that wouldn't be so bad. But I do think, I like some of those traditions. If it's a certain person in your family, given how close they may be, you wear the armband for a certain amount of time. And I I think it's helpful because we give so little space to grief. My middle brother, my surviving brother, when our dad died, he got like 2 days of bereavement leave, from working for a large company. He just 2 days off, which was basically like one day for the funeral and one day to like help my mom sell my dad's car and do like 3 errands. And that was it. And other than that, he was like nights and weekends And I could take as much time as I want because I'm self-employed, but not if I wanted to get paid, So everyone is making these trade-offs, I think, as adults who are trying to be present for aging parents, or when there is bereavement in our families. We don't have a society that gives much space for that. And even among, wonderful friends, it kind of plays it's top of mind for people for a couple weeks. People bring food, send cards. They're thoughtful and wonderful, and I'm blessed to have just wonderful friends in my life. But then after 3, 4, 5 weeks, like, people are moving on with other things, which is normal and natural. But there's no cue in our society that says, oh, hey, remember that person lost their mom 2 months ago, maybe check in. And so something like a black armband or some external signifier, I think, would be helpful in just helping people remember.
Oh, exactly. And even when you're standing in line in the grocery store, for people to think, oh, I know why this person is behaving differently, because I see the black armband and they're going through grief, and I'll have compassion, and I'll show them kindness right now. Maybe we could become a kinder society if we understood that.
Yeah. I hope for that at some point.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to talk about, for one thing, I know that you used movement in terms of like circus arts, which is amazing to me, to help you with your grief. And you are a circus aerialist. And I have to say, I watched a video of you that was on the Touching Two Worlds website that you made, that was so stunning and so beautiful. Of are they called silks, or it's that you elevate yourself?
An aerial fabric.
Aerial fabric. Okay. Because it was just the most beautiful performance. It just brought me to tears. And I know so the music was part of that you chose, Angel by the Wings by Sia, which the words are very touching and profound. But there was this moment in your routine when I think you were fairly high up on the silks, and then it's as if you just dropped and fell, and you ended up like catching yourself just by your feet upside down in the silk. I don't even know if I'm describing it
no, you are absolutely right. Yep.
The moment I saw that, I thought, that's how grief feels. That's what grief is. And I felt like that's what it's like. You just suddenly, you fall, and luckily you catch yourself somehow, but you have to pull yourself back up. I don't know if that was intentional, but it was so beautiful and so evocative. So I would encourage listeners to go to the Touching Two Worlds website and watch that video. It was just very beautifully done. So I wanted to thank you for posting that. Thank you for your creativity and being able to express so much emotion through this art form.
Yeah, it's really been such a gift to me to be able to do it. I'm in my mid-40s and I don't have a dance or gymnastics background. The fact that I got into this is totally random, but it's been that creative and emotional outlet that I really have needed in the intensity of all this grief and loss. And so to have the ability to move your body in a way that sort of matches what's happening inside is quite, I think it helps to feel integrated. It helps to heal, because you're not living in these two realities where everything inside is like on fire with pain, and you're like walking about your life nice and polite, and meeting with the teachers for conferences and like keeping up appearances. So at least I had this space to release some of this emotion, and it's become really important to me in my personal life, and then something that I'm integrating more and more into my work with other people, because I feel like all of us are kind of desperate for movement that has that emotional quality.
What other forms of movement do you recommend safe? Well, for people like me, afraid of heights, I probably wouldn't be doing aerial arts, but
Oh, there's so many things. I think dance is certainly one. Yoga is wonderful in the sense that, especially if you have a trauma-informed or let's say a grief-informed yoga teacher, there's some asanas or poses in yoga that are really powerful. I mean, I think we think about child's pose where you're sort of all huddled in on yourself. And that can feel like some of the vulnerability of grief, or there's warrior poses where maybe you cling or you squeeze your fists and it's a warrior that's angry and has some like bite to it. It doesn't have to be this sort of like, oh, I'm peaceful in my yoga. Like it can be emotional. I also think weightlifting is wonderful. Like as my dad was going through chemotherapy, I would go to the gym and, those big ropes, they're called battle ropes. I would just beat those ropes on the ground just with every little muscle of my body, and just like I wanted to just beat the cancer down, or, it just was a very aggressive, angry, fierce movement, but it matched what I was feeling inside and gave my body an outlet. I've known people too they've taken up distance running or walking or, anything that just brings you to the point where you can pour some of that internal feeling into your external body. I think is really healing.
And it seems like it can help us get unstuck in a way if we're feeling emotionally stuck and not able to move, which is kind of where I was for about 3 years after my dad's death. It seems like physical movement might literally just help break some of that stagnation down in a way.
There's some wonderful recent work around this topic. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and then When the Body Says No by Dr. Gabor Mate. Both of those books really speak to that relationship between our quote unquote physical bodies and our mental or emotional bodies. Of course, we sort of arbitrarily divided those as if they're separate. They're not separate, but we think about them separately. But when we really bring our full self into our experiences and into our grief, I feel like it's hard to hold grief just, sitting politely in a chair. Grief is a full body experience. Sometimes it's very still, but sometimes it's raging. And I think we need the range of expression to help our bodies not feel frozen in that incongruence.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Well, it's interesting because you also write about being on airplanes a lot because you were traveling back and forth when your dad was ill, and for your brother as well. You spent a lot of time on airplanes where you're kind of forced to be still in the moment. But I really appreciated one of your chapters on the art of crying on airplanes, which actually it's really practical information, because I'm sure that's a pretty common phenomenon when someone goes through a traumatic or crisis experience. They end up flying somewhere to be with someone. So just tell us a little bit about that chapter.
So the vast majority of my book was written on airplanes, to be honest, because again, it was like this only time when I was still, and I was flying quite a lot during this season. And I think a lot of people fear what will happen if they become emotional in public or if they break down. And my answer to that, of course, is like, we'll make a plan, like have a situation. So for me on an airplane, like always the window seat. Like, I don't care if I have to sit in the back. Like, I just want to have something I can turn toward to kind of hide my face if I need to. And I started wearing either like a hoodie with a hood on it, or maybe some kind of like a scarf, something I could pull over my head and cover my face with, which is a little silly to be, like a 40-something professional with a PhD and I'm like wearing a hoodie on my head in public. But it felt protected and it felt safe. And I think also I would get the big headphones, the ones like the Beats or whatever, like the cool kids have, but in that just really clear sense of like, I am not available for conversation, right? This very clear sign, don't talk to me.
And
I
maybe they're
think
not even plugged into anything. You just have the headphones on.
sometimes they were just silent. They're just on noise cancel. And so I think those kinds of things, if you could throw them in your backpack, it just feels like, okay, if it becomes too much, I've got a plan. I won't feel like I'm walking around in my underwear in public. Like I can cover my grief if I need to. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, it's such a practical plan, and it makes sense. And I'm wondering, I'm sure flight attendants are probably a group of people who could use training in how to be there for someone who's grieving, because I bet they encounter that a lot on airplanes.
I felt like they know. I mean, there's a real difference between someone who's like flying to California for vacation and someone like me who was clearly on that plane for a very different reason.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I have so many notes because I loved everything about your book, so I wrote every single thing down that I wanted to talk about. But one thing that I really liked, you wrote about rewriting our assumptions about the world, and that grief and loss kind of forces us into that. And an example, the world is benevolent, rewriting it, because the world doesn't always feel benevolent, rewriting it into the world can be benevolent, but is not guaranteed to be fair. And I thought that was really brilliant. It's such a perfect answer for some of those catchphrases that we hear all the time in life that they just don't always apply, and they're not always fitting in these situations.
Everything happens for a reason.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But we don't necessarily have to throw them out completely, but they need to be rewritten, and they need to be written in maybe from a bigger perspective where we're holding all of the aspects of it. We're holding a much bigger truth about these little phrases that we say.
Yeah. This I'm pulling from Ronnie Janoff Bullman's work here. She wrote a wonderful book called Shattered Assumptions, which is very specific to the ways that our beliefs get kind of reworked after trauma. And we all need kind of an operating system, right? We all need a set of assumptions or a schema that we carry around that helps to sort of guide how we see the world. And after grief or trauma, they break, right? Because we don't walk around with the assumption that people we love can die on a moment's notice. None of us want to walk around like that, because I think it would paralyze us. So we kind of walk around as if like, oh, everybody's cool, everybody's fine, we're okay. And of course, when that tragic death enters our experience, it breaks the assumption, and we have to like figure out like, how do I live in a world where everyone I love can die at any moment? So you sort of soften the assumption, you find a new way with it, which is to say, sometimes in extraordinary conditions and extraordinary, unusual circumstances, sometimes people you love die. But you don't want to let the fear of that take away the joy of being with them or of living your life. And so I think that rewriting work is really, it's often kind of the work you're doing in therapy after grief or after trauma, is like, how do I make sense of the world now? How do I put the pieces back together in a way where they hold?
I resonate with that, because one of my operating assumptions when I was young and idealistic and going through medical school and becoming a doctor was this belief that love heals. That is what motivated me. I wanted to always be able to bring forth love in my care for patients, because I really felt like love is the best opportunity to help someone heal, to love them. And then when my father died, and I recognized, but I loved him more than anyone, and I couldn't heal him, it totally shattered that belief in it. And it wasn't until I read this in your book, I realized, oh, that's what I was doing all those years. I was trying to put together a new belief system that included love can and does heal people at times, but people, as you just said, people that we love will still die. And it doesn't mean that we can reverse life itself and the process of life and how things move on.
Yeah, I did some work with that one too, that idea, because I really, really loved my brother. I mean, really loved him. And I did a lot to try to prevent this outcome. And so I think for me, I had that same like nobody like that there was no more love to give. Like that was all the love was yours and it wasn't enough. Um but I think the reworking of that one for me was this sense that my love for him healed me almost out of order. Like the fact that I did love him so well and so deeply and so much, I think helped me to sort of loosen that sense of responsibility. So I have like a new schema around it, is that the way that I love, the way that I show up in love is the thing that will hurt or heal me, but it's not really the thing that will determine other people's course or their choices. So we'll see how that bears out over the rest of my life. I don't know, but it's the working assumption right now.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's so well put. And kind of with what I was saying when I realized that I can't change the course of my dad's life. That's not even my job. That's not what I'm here for, to change his life or reroute him in some different direction. I'm simply here to love as much as I can and then to accept whatever happens and how things unfold.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's very beautiful and very profound. And I want to emphasize to listeners that your book has just this amazing combination of telling your story and telling it with so much vulnerability, but then you also have sections in your book called, Take a Moment, where you help people reflect on their own experiences and actually give exercises that people can do. And I think that is in a way the best of both worlds too, because you lead people into this territory of loss and grief, but then you show them with tools what they can do with their own pain as they're reflecting on their own experience.
It felt like quite a gift to be able to do both. I think, at least in my training as a psychologist, we tend to keep our personal experiences sort of separate from our professional work. And there are lots of good reasons for that. But I think in this case, I mean, obviously I can't write a grief book without my grief story. But it also isn't quite right to just, at least for me at this point in my life, isn't quite right to just tell the story and then leave it and be like, isn't this very sad? There's this part of my world that is to be a helper. I also wrote about the things that were legitimately helpful to me, whether it's yoga or circus or this journaling assignment or that. But it's feels really gratifying to be able to work on a project that really drew from my full self. The mother, the daughter, the sister, the wife, the professional, the artist. And I think all of that is in this book, which is why I'm really happy it's out in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really a gift. And I was going to ask you, I know from your bio that you work with high achieving entrepreneurs and help them navigate change and loss. Does your grief experience, has it informed how you work with your clients? Has it made a difference for you?
It has, in a lot of ways. Some good, some bad, maybe. I mean, I'm a little more fearless than I guess maybe not fearless isn't the right word, but I'm much more willing to just say what I see and say what I think and kind of be more direct, because I think I have a little bit of a time urgency now that I have a deeper sense of the fragility of time. And so I think my clients perceive me maybe as a little bit edgier, which they like works for the folks I work with. But I also think that my clients don't necessarily like to be reminded of so much fragility. And because I've chosen to not hide that part of my life and to be quite public about it, I think sometimes they want a mindset coach who's going to help them perform more in less time, which I understand. But I'm also very much about helping people really enjoy the moments that they have because they're such gifts. So, yeah.
So true. And really, all of life is about navigating some sort of change or another, even all the good changes of getting married and having children. It's all about how do we let go of how things used to be and move into a new world where we're dealing with different issues. And there is a certain amount of grief involved in all of that, the work that we do.
Yeah. And I mean, we obviously, in the context of this conversation, have been talking a lot about grief as it relates to death, which is what my book is focused on. But I'm also so impacted and aware of the many kinds of grief that people are carrying and holding. And as you say, sometimes it's even in wonderful things that grief is also present. My oldest son is getting ready to go to college next year. And so I'm in this wonderful phase of this great young man who's off to do whatever he's going to do, but also the grief that goes along with that shift, I think, is very real and very important. And again, that sort of universal phase that we don't always talk about or prepare ourselves for, the grief part of parenting or the grief part of being a partner, which doesn't necessarily involve death, but just the loss of or change of something.
And it seems to me that the tools that you've offered in your book would be helpful with all of these changes and losses, no matter where people find themselves. And I wanted to say too that though we know from the outset of the book that the story you share is going to be challenging, we know the story of the two deaths will be challenging to listen to. You write about them in such, it's very raw and very honest and vulnerable, but also gentle in a sense, in the way that you lead the reader through the story. And you've done a really wonderful job of presenting these two stories and making it easy for the reader to go on that journey with you.
Oh, thank you, Karen. That means so much.
So I'll remind listeners that I'm talking with Sherry Walling, the author of Touching Two Worlds, A Guide for Finding Hope in the Landscape of Loss, which is a book everyone should read. And but you also should go to touchingtwoworlds.com and watch the video I was mentioning of Sherry in this aerial performance that it's just very lovely. And
thank you.
And I'm in awe that you're able to do that.
Me too, some days, honestly. I'm like, wait, I just did that. Oh my gosh.
Wow. Talk about courage. But yeah, I'm very impressed. It makes me wish I could do something like that.
I'm not sure that you can't. I think that's one of the things that it's really helped me challenge is some of my beliefs around body and age and those kinds of things. But my trapeze coach is in her mid-70s and she's teaching flying trapeze.
Oh my gosh.
So,
wow. Well,
anyway.
I have to keep that in mind.
And watch out for your self-limiting beliefs, Karen.
That's true. And the song, of course, the Sia song, Angel by the Wings, the chorus is, you can do anything. And that's such a good reminder. Because even if we're in the midst of our grief and we're suffering and feeling lost and feeling like we've just dropped down and we're barely holding on, we can do what we need to do. We really can. We can get through it. Yeah. Well, thank you, Sherry, thank you for writing the beautiful book, and thank you for coming here to talk to me about it. And I really appreciate it, and I'm so glad to be connected with you now.
My pleasure. And thank you for the invitation for the conversation. It's been wonderful.
You're very welcome. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Sherry Walling. I was very touched by her book, everything in it, really. And she is such a beautiful writer. I hope you'll get her book and read it. Also, be sure to watch her video of aerial acrobatics. It's amazing to Sia's song, Angel by the Wings. And it's amazing, a really incredible, heartfelt depiction of her grief through aerial art. So I know you'll enjoy that too. So we'll see you the next time with another new video.